Okay, so we're here with Chapter 2 for trade-offs, the comparative advantage and market system. We're going to be going through three things: our production possibilities frontier and opportunity costs, our comparative advantage and trade, and the market system. That's slide 2 of 33. Moving to slide 3. Scarcity and trade-offs. Households, firms, and governments continually face decisions about how to best use their scarce resources. Scarcity is a situation in which our unlimited wants exceed the limited resources available to fulfill those wants. So scarcity requires some trade-offs, and economics teaches us tools to help us make good trade-offs. So for example, when deciding how to use its scarce workers and machinery, Tesla may decide to produce more Model X SUVs, but then those resources will not be available to produce Model S sedans. So moving to slide 4, we have our production possibilities frontier, PPF, and our opportunity costs. And we're going to use that PPF to analyze the opportunity costs and the trade-offs. So we move to slide 5, and we see that the production possibilities frontier is a curve showing the maximum attainable combinations of two products that may be purchased with available resources and technology. So our question, is it a positive or normative tool? The answer, positive, because it will show us what is, not what should be. So moving to slide 6, we see that we have a possibility production frontier, and we have 5 points, A, B, C, D, and E. At point A, we see that 80 sedans are produced and no SUVs are produced. At point B, 60 sedans, 20 SUVs. Point C, 40 sedans, 40 SUVs. Point D, 20 sedans, 60 SUVs. And point E, 0 sedans and 80 SUVs. On the y-axis, we have the quantity of sedans produced per day. On the x-axis, the quantity of SUVs produced per day, as opposed to sedans, which is on the y-axis. So now we see these points that we have in our table above reflected actually on a line going from 80 on the y-axis to 80 on the x-axis. At each point, the other is equal to 0, right? Whereas at a point like B, we're at 60 on the y-axis and 20 on the x-axis. At point C, we're at 40 and 40 on each axis. Point D, we're at 20 on the y-axis and 60 on the x-axis. So points G and F are certain points we need to talk about. G is unattainable. We don't have enough resources to reach that point, so it's impossible at this point. Point F is a point we can reach because it's under our curve, but it actually shows inefficiency, right? Because I'm only making 30 sedans and 10 SUVs when I could be making more, right? I could be making probably about 30 sedans and maybe 50 SUVs. So I am underutilizing my resources and technology, and so that is an inefficient point, which is very different from point G, which is a point we just can't reach at all. So moving to slide F, we're again still looking at the same table and graph. And we're talking about now the actual opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is we're giving up 20. We're giving up 20 SUVs to produce more, actually it's the other way around. To produce 20 more SUVs, we're going to give up 20 sedans. So the 20 fewer sedans is the opportunity cost of producing more SUVs. And remember that our opportunity cost is our highest valued alternative that must be given up to engage in activity. Now this is assuming, of course, that our opportunity cost is constant. It's not going to always be constant. So if we go to the next graph, we're going to see what happens in a non-constant situation. And now we have like a bowed or curved graph where the point A is 400 tanks and no automobiles, but point B is 350 tanks and 200 automobiles. So we actually gained 200 automobiles, but we only lost 50 tanks. But now when you see we go from point B to point C, we have to give up 150 tanks just to get another 200 automobiles. So the opportunity cost is increasing. And so our first initial switch is the best switch that we make, and then any additional switches we make after that are not as advantageous for us. So we see at the bottom it says the more resources already devoted to an activity, the smaller the payoff to devoting additional resources to that activity. So this is a case of increasing marginal opportunity costs. Remember that marginal means that we're making it at the edge, at the margin, and we're going to see what happens if we take an extra step. Would that be a positive or negative thing for us? Would there be increased benefits or lower costs, or the other way around? Would there be increased costs and lower benefits? So in this particular case, the cost is going to keep increasing at the margin as we continue to make more switches, and that's going to be bad for us. So we go to slide 9, and we're looking now at a BODE possibility production frontier. And we're seeing that we move from point A to point B, and that shift from the first curve to the second curve represents economic growth, which is that more resources became available and we could move from point A to point B, producing both more tanks and more automobiles. So now we could have produced at most 400 tanks, but now we can produce up to 500 tanks, and before we could only produce 500 automobiles maximum, now we can produce 625 automobiles maximum. So we've shifted to a greater point. Point B is a point we could not have attained before, but for the economic growth. Going to slide 10, we see where the technological change is only in one industry. So here, our maximum point of automobiles has shifted from 500 to 800, but our tanks has not shifted at all. It still remains the same 400 maximum that we can produce if we produce no automobiles. Excuse me. So this is an example of possibility production frontier where the change is only in one industry. So moving to slide 11, we're faced with a situation about exam grades. And so we have to study for 2 exams, economics and accounting. They're both in the same time period, so we don't have all the time in the world to study for both. So now we may have to give up one for the other. What would the PPF curve look like for these exam grades? Would it be a straight line like the PPF for sedans and SUVs, or would it be a bowed outward curve like the PPF for tanks and automobiles? No, it's going to be a bowed outward curve, and the reason being is that the first hour we spend studying economics is much more valuable than the last hour. So, in other words, we've got diminishing benefits, diminishing marginal benefits, that we get our greatest benefits during that first hour, but then every additional hour does not give us the same amount of value that we had with the first hour. And that's what's going to make it a bowed curve. Going to slide 12, we are going to describe comparative advantage and explain how it serves the basis for trade. So moving to slide 13, we now are faced with apples and cherries. And we can pick at maximum 20 apples if we pick no cherries, or we can pick 20 cherries if we pick no apples. So that's our production possibility frontier. Our neighbor, on the other hand, has a different scenario where they can pick 30 pounds of apples and no cherries, or 60 pounds of cherries and no apples. So our neighbor has what's called an absolute advantage as opposed to us, but we're going to be shown to have a comparative advantage, and we're going to learn why in the next few slides. So let's continue to slide 14, where now we are looking at, we still have the same table on the bottom, but now we're looking at the possibility production frontier for our neighbor, and you can see there clearly on the graph how they can produce 30 apples maximum and 60 cherries maximum, assuming they do nothing of the other. And when we move to slide 15, we now are faced with the idea, well, what happens if you trade? What happens if you trade where one specializes in apples and the other specializes in cherries? And then you trade apples for cherries, that you both can have apples and cherries. So what we have then at that point is an opportunity to gain from trade. So moving to slide 15, we can see that we can specialize in trade. We can engage in the act of buying and selling. Could your neighbor benefit from trade? Well, your neighbor is better at picking both apples and cherries, which is considered an absolute advantage, but that's not the be-all, end-all. both of you can benefit from trade by specializing in what you're good at. Let's see how. So going to slide 16, we can see that now we have both curves, our curve and our neighbor's curve. And normally we're going to both try to do both, right? So we're going to pick 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries, which is point A on the curve on the left. Our neighbor's going to pick 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries, which is point C on the right. So moving to slide 17, we can see that we could just go ahead and specialize in picking apples, and we can pick 20 pounds of apples. Our neighbor can specialize in picking cherries, so they'll pick 60 pounds of cherries. So if we trade now 10 pounds of our apples for 15 pounds of our neighbor's cherries, we can have 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of cherries, which is point B, a point we could not previously obtain along our PPF. And our neighbor now has gotten 10 pounds of apples from us and gave up 15 pounds of cherries, so moved from 60 to 45, which is point D in the right panel. So we are both better off as a result of our trade. So going to slide 18, we actually see the summary of the gains from trade. Production and consumption without trade, we have 8 apples and 12 cherries. Our neighbor has 9 apples and 42 cherries. I'm talking about pounds now, not really the actual quantity of each. And then in our production with trade, we would just produce 20 pounds of apples and our neighbor would just produce 60 pounds of cherries. In our consumption with trade, we now give up 10 of our pounds of apples and we have 10 pounds left, and we have 15 pounds of cherries that we gained from the trade. Our neighbor now has 10 pounds of apples that they received from us, and they lost 15 pounds of cherries, going down to 45. So the last line, which is gains from trade, actually is the subtraction of the first line from the third line. So 10 minus 8 is 2. 15 minus 12 is 3. 10 minus 9 is 1. And 45 minus 42 is 3. Those are the gains we made that we can actually better our position by engaging in trade. And that is because of the fact that we had a comparative advantage, which is going to be explained on slide 19. Slide 19, explaining the gains from specialization in trade. How could we both benefit from trade when the neighbor was so much better? The neighbor had an absolute advantage. The neighbor was better at cherry and apple picking, but we had a comparative advantage in picking apples, and that has to do with opportunity costs. So absolute advantage is the ability of an individual, a firm or country to produce more of a good or service than competitors using the same amount of resources. So we both are assuming the example to have had the same amount of resources, but our neighbor was just so much better picking either 30 apples or 60 cherries, and we could only produce 20 and 20. So our neighbor had the absolute advantage in either category. But we had a comparative advantage because we actually have a better opportunity cost in picking apples than our neighbor does. And we're going to see why in the next slide, how that is explained. But that did not mean that just because our neighbor had an absolute advantage at both, that we didn't have a comparative advantage at one, such that our neighbor would be better off if we specialize in apples and they in cherries. So going to slide 20, we see now the actual opportunity costs. If we were to pick just apples, we lose 1 pound of cherries for every 1 pound of apples, but our neighbor loses 2 pounds of cherries. Because remember, they're able to produce 60 as opposed to 30, so they're producing twice the amount of cherries as they are apples. That's why they have an opportunity cost of 2. And then when we look at cherries, we also still are just losing 1 pound of apples as opposed to 1 pound of cherries, because we were at 20 and 20, so it was a 1-to-1 ratio. Whereas because our neighbor was twice as good at cherries than apples, when we picked the 1 pound of cherries, we're only losing a half a pound of apples for our neighbor. So if you see there, 1 is less than 2 on the left-hand side. So that means we have a better opportunity cost, a lower opportunity cost in terms of giving up cherries for apples. But they have a lower opportunity cost on the right-hand side of giving up apples for cherries. So as a result, we should be the ones making apples and they should be the ones making cherries. The basis for trade is comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Individuals, firms, and countries are better off if they specialize in producing goods and services for which they have a comparative advantage and obtain the others goods and services they need by trading. So trade is necessary. Trade is beneficial. Don't try to do it all yourself. Slide 21, people living together have to divide up household chores. Basic concepts like comparative advantage can provide useful insight in the division of labor. So we'll say Jack is faster than Jill at cooking and laundry, right? Just like how our neighbor was better than us in apples and cherries, the absolute advantage. But Jack is much faster at preparing tasty meals while he's only a little faster at doing laundry. So he's going to do what he's best at. He's going to use his comparative advantage in cooking and give you the comparative advantage, Jill, in doing laundry. So as a result, you both can benefit from trade where he focuses on the cooking and Jill focuses on the laundry, right? So moving to slide 22, we talk more about the market system and how it works. Slide 23, we see that there are two key groups: households, which consist of individuals who provide the factors of production, and firms, which provide goods and services to product markets. So we have the households selling their services or items in the factor markets, and the firms are selling their goods and services in the product markets. Households need to buy products from firms, and firms need to buy labor, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurial ability from households. With labor, we mean all kinds of work. With capital, we mean the type of capital used to produce other goods. With natural resources, we mean land, water, oil, ore, raw materials, etc. And with entrepreneurial ability, we mean that ability to bring together all the factors of production. So going to slide 24, we look at the circular diagram, and we see that at the top is households, at the bottom are firms, to the left are product markets, to the right are factor markets. And this is just a way of visualizing what I just described to you, which is that the households are going to be selling labor, they're going to be selling capital, they're going to be selling natural resources, they're going to be selling entrepreneurial ability into the factor markets, which are then going to be bought by the firms. But then the firms are going to produce their goods and services, and they're going to release them to the product markets, which then the households are going to buy as they need for their lives and their homes, right? So it's a circle. It goes round and round and round. Things are sold in the product markets and the factor markets all the time, and we go round and round, back and forth, and it is a relationship in which both households and firm gain as a whole. Looking at the slide 25, it's again still the same slide, but we're also looking at what is the interference of government, a financial system, foreign goods, and buyers. Well, there is none, because there's a simplified model at this point in which we want to get you acquainted with the basic concepts, and we don't want to introduce more complicated concepts until a later point in time when we're ready to expand our model and develop it further. So going to slide 26, we see that a free market is one with few government restrictions on how a good or service can be produced or how a factor of production can be employed. Countries that come closest to the free market benchmark have been more successful than those with centrally planned economies in providing their people with rising living standards. In other words, capitalist countries versus socialist countries versus communist countries. This concept is not new. Adam Smith argued for free markets in his 1776 treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations. He talks about the invisible hand, which we're going to see more on slide 27. The beauty of the market mechanism is that it is not immediately obvious that markets can do better than centrally planned systems for satisfying human desires. After all, individuals are acting in their own rational self-interest. By this we mean it's not that we're doing this out of benevolence or love for our fellow man or woman. It is that we are acting in our own best interests, and our transaction with one another will be market clearing transactions that will result in hopefully optimal scenarios where everybody gains. So markets with flexible prices allow the collective actions of households and firms to signal the relative worth of goods and services. In other words, we let people know what we're willing to buy for. Sellers let people know what they're willing to sell for. We detect the signals from the other from a communication standpoint. Messages are being sent back and forth. And eventually, after negotiation, we can come to some price we can agree on, and a transaction occurs and trade is made. We all benefit from this. So the invisible hand allows individual responses to collectively end up satisfying the wants of consumers. Slide 28, we see a story of the market system in action. How do you make an iPad? Apple engineers may design the iPad, but Apple does not necessarily manufacture the iPad components, nor does it assemble the final product. That's what it has other companies for. Hundreds of firms are involved. Many don't even know that their products will be used in iPad. They just know they're selling their components to the highest bidder, right, at a price that everyone can agree on, and that inevitably then people at Apple are directing these components to be shipped to certain vendors who then are involved in the manufacture by putting these parts together until eventually it becomes the finished product that is an iPad. So everyone's acting in their own best self-interest to contribute to the final product, whether they know they are or not, and without any desire to enrich Apple or iPad, but that the end result is that iPad consumers and purchasers are very happy. Looking at slide 29, we look at the role of an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is someone who brings together the factors of production, land, labor, and capital to produce goods and services. The best entrepreneurs create products that consumers never even knew they wanted. Right? If we think about Henry Ford, he said, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. They couldn't envision anything other than a horse, but he was able to envision the car, and then the world was changed. Steve Jobs did the same thing. People didn't know they needed an iPhone or an iPad or an iPod, but these ideas were created. They were released into the market, and once people saw these products, they were unable to resist, and they were like, where have you been all my life, right? So in other words, entrepreneurs make vital contributions to economic growth, often with considerable personal risk and sacrifice. Not everything's going to work out. There have been bombs. There have been failures. But then we have some amazing successes that advance our society as a whole. Looking at slide 30, we see some of the different entrepreneurs over the years that have been famous inventors. So we have air conditioning, the airplane, the automobile, biomagnetic engineering, insulin, DNA fingerprinting, the vacuum tube, and the zipper. We have all the different individuals involved, like Ford and the Wright brothers, and Boyer, and Jeffries, and Carrier, and Farnsworth, and Sunback. And that hopefully also the government is structuring its policies to encourage entrepreneurship so that we can increase economic growth and raise our standards of living. Because everyone is better off by the invisible hand, as you recall from Adam Smith's model of capitalism. So now on slide 31, we look at the legal basis for a successful market system, and that's the rule of law. The government does not restrict how firms produce or sell goods or how they employ factors of production, but they at least need to provide a legal environment that protects certain things, like private property and the enforcement of contract and property rights. With private property, you don't want criminals to take your wages or profits, and if they do, then what's the point anymore, right? Because you have no protection. So you're going to say there's no point in working hard because someone else is just going to come along and take it. And that includes intellectual property, right? In other words, if you come up with a great idea, if someone copies it and steals it next week, then your idea may be eclipsed by the other idea, and then no one gains. And so you then lose incentive to want to keep doing wonderful things if someone else is just going to steal your idea. And contracts and property rights, again, if you have a contract with me to produce 1 million products, and then I find another buyer who's willing to pay more money for the 1 million products, and I say I'm going to, get out of my deal with you, I'm going to renege, you're not going to be happy because you're counting on those products to come through so that then you can sell to your customers and make a profit. So you may sue me for specific performance in court that says I should have to fulfill the contract and give you the 1 million products that I promised you. And that is part of the rule of law of a working system, a court system that's critical to ensuring that property rights are observed and contracts are enforced. So now looking at the Wizard of Oz, here's a case of a loophole, right? Because the Wizard of Oz was originally, I think, produced by MGM, and then it was sold the rights to Warner Brothers. So Warner Brothers currently owns those rights, but Disney wanted to make a movie based off of this story, and they had to figure out a way to do it so as to avoid copyright infringement. So their lawyers sat with them, and they changed all kinds of ideas, and they came out with a movie called Oz the Great and Powerful. And in so doing, they were very careful not to steal the ideas that are owned by the Warner Brothers, but to create all new ideas that were sufficiently different, because once you have something that's a new creation, even if it may incorporate elements from previous things, it is not necessarily copyright infringement. Lastly, on slide 33, we see that there are some common misconceptions to avoid. Number one, the possibility production's frontier should never grow inward. Why? Well, that would be inefficient, right? I mean, we're going to be going to the point of our either linear line or bowed line, we're not going to be going inwards because that's inefficient. We need it to expand outwards. The possibility production frontier usually always expands outwards to the most that the resources allow, not inwards where we're engaging in inefficient operations. The possibility production frontier, number 2, also tells us what can be produced, not what should be produced. That is a positive tool rather than a normative tool. Number 3, just because someone is better or worse at everything does not mean trade with them cannot be beneficial. Remember, the basis for trade is comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Even though our neighbor was better at making apples and cherries, we still had a comparative advantage with respect to apples, which is why it was better for us to focus on apples and our neighbor on cherries, and then for us to trade for what we didn't make. And lastly, number 4, free markets raise the standard of living, but that doesn't mean that there is no role for governments. Governments must at least provide a sound legal environment with the rule of law to allow the market system to succeed. And that includes protecting copyrights and our goods and services so that we don't constantly suffer the possibility of being defrauded or theft of our valuable items that would then give us no incentive to continue to produce. That ends our presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you.